busy middle, almost end of the week, so we're going to go ahead and start on time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and welcome to our webinar. Sorry, did I say it wrong? My name is Simone Williams, founder of Williams Global Law, a U.S. immigration and business law firm based in Washington, D.C. Today's conversation is titled, which is a very exciting topic because of my roots are from Toronto, Canada, but from Snowbird, which we call snowbirds, people who come all the way from North Canada to warmer places. So from snowbird to strategic resident, the U.S. investment green card, or what we call EB-5 visa for Canadians. We're seeing a growing number of Canadian families who already spend significant time in the United States, often through second homes, seasonal living, or business activity. And at some point, what begins as a lifestyle decision becomes a long-term strategic question. And the question becomes, should we formalize our ability to live in the United States? And this is the types of questions we get from Canadians. And that's where the EB-5 Immigrant Investor Program often enters the discussion. So today, our goal is not to sell projects or get overly technical. Instead, we really want to help Canadian investors understand, one, when immigration planning becomes relevant, how the EB-5 landscape has changed, and what that means and what EB-5 is, what disciplined due diligence looks like, and how immigration strategy fits into the investment decision. So we have a fantastic group of speakers joining us today, bringing perspectives from immigration law, capital markets, real estate, and project evaluation. So before we begin, I'd like each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. Let's start with Josh. Josh, could you tell us a little more about your background and your experience living and working in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm also from Toronto, Canada, currently where I'm situated right now. I own a real estate brokerage here. And recently we started a journey into the US where we also opened a real estate brokerage in the US, because there's no negative in having your feet in two different markets, especially where a lot of Canadians are traveling to and spending more time given the current climate of the world, and Toronto. And we've done that through the E2 program. So now I'm currently working myself under the E2 treaty program in the United States, in the state of Florida, with my family back and forth, comfortably working between the two.
All right, great. Thank you, Josh. Next, I'll turn to Alex, who works very closely with developments coming out of Washington and EB-5 policy and the regulatory update. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Simone. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Alex Lovelace. I've been in the EB-5 space since 2012. I've really been focused on more of the rural side of EB-5 because I grew up in North Dakota, which is a very rural state. I've been a part of about $600 million in EB-5 raises in different rural projects across the country. And in some of those projects, I learned that there wasn't really a voice for rural regional centers and developers in Washington, D.C. So about a decade ago, we started a trade association called the EB-5 Rural Alliance, and we represent those rural regional centers and developers in Washington. And over the last decade, we've created really strong relationships with some of the key offices, both on the Judiciary Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction over EB-5, and also within the Senate and House leadership. And we were really involved in talking about a lot of the reforms that came to fruition with the RIA when the program was reauthorized in 2022. And I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And finally, we have Andrew, who brings the broker and investor advisory perspective. Andrew works closely with investors evaluating EB-5 opportunities and performing due diligence on projects. So Andrew, welcome. If you could please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Simone. So Andrew Wall, I'm based down in Miami, Florida. We've been working in the EB-5 industry for almost 14 years now. Transitioned from working for projects to actually evaluating deals and allowing the investors to analyze a little bit of the different offerings in the market instead of being stuck under kind of one platform. It's an important feature of what we do. A lot of the investors go on and they start trying to understand how the program works and then trying to understand what kind of assets there are and how they kind of combine. So we help kind of bridge that gap, understand it, make it a little bit more palatable for the investors, and then consistently kind of handhold the investors along the way. That's a little bit of our overview. We are consistently active in the market, understanding legislation changes, potential changes within policy, within procedures within USCIS, and then also the ever kind of evolving process of these individual projects. They're consistently changing on a quarterly basis. So it's a lot to kind of take in for investors. And, we're there a little bit to just support them along the way.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So let's jump in. I think before we talk about specific visa options, it's helpful to step back and look at what we're actually seeing among Canadians who spend time in the United States. So many Canadians already have deep ties in the US. They may own second homes in places like Florida, Arizona, or California, or they may spend several months a year in the US as what we call snowbirds. But there are a few common misconceptions that often come up. First, I think many people assume that because Canadians can enter easily as visitors, they can simply spend as much time as they want in the United States. And in reality, visitor status has very real practical limits, and extended stays can eventually raise questions with US border officers. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing we frequently see are families who purchase property in the United States, assuming that home ownership creates a pathway to residency. And it actually doesn't. So it's important to understand that owning a home in the United States is a real estate decision. Immigration status is a completely separate legal process. So what often happens is that a lifestyle decision, buying a home, spending winters here, building business connections, eventually leads families to ask a different question. Should we formalize our ability to live in the United States on a long-term basis? And so that's usually when immigration planning enters the conversation. So Josh, since you're working closely with Canadian investors, obviously you've done the process yourself with your family, navigating and working closely with Canadian real estate owners and investors, navigating the transition. I love to hear your perspective. So from your experience, when do Canadians begin realizing that snowbird living has limits and that they may need a more permanent immigration strategy?
Great question. I mean, what I'm noticing now is historically, you would see a lot of people in their 50s, 60s starting to snowbird a lot. And what I'm noticing right now is a lot of young families actually starting to make the transition out of Toronto or out of Canada and wanting to live in the US. And part of that starts to happen is that it's fairly straightforward to enter into the US on an E2 program with certain things being done and dollar values being spent. But what starts to happen is if you have two young kids that you're entering the US with, and then, you start to develop this lifestyle and really develop roots in Florida or anywhere in the US, what's starting to happen is you get to a point where how long can you keep doing this the E2 or on a visitor visa or a business visa, and when does that conversation start to become, hey, this is a long-term plan here? So what I'm noticing is a lot of people starting to, at the same time they start the E2 program and come into the E2, they're also starting the EB-5 conversation, understanding that, hey, like E2 will get me so far, but EB-5 is something that I really need to consider for a more structured and long-term solution to raise a family or have a life in the US long-term, get me certain levels of rights and certain things like that, especially, as kids grow up too, right? Like the E2 program only covers your kids in your household under a certain age. At that point, if they go to university and they come back, they might not be covered under that anymore. So we're starting to see that conversation come up sooner with people. And I'm having that conversation, like, you can enter on that E2, but it's going to transition to EB-5 quite quickly and, get yourself in line with it, because that process also takes some time.
And Josh, you mentioned the E2 visa. So many Canadians view the E2 as a flexible option because of the lower capital requirement. Can you walk us through how you ended up on the E2 visa and possibly just thinking about EB-5 in the long term?
Yeah, I think, coming from Canada, personally, I'm not someone who's just going to, jump and switch tomorrow. I have a lifestyle here. I have a business here. So E2 was the more straightforward path in the beginning right now, at least to get the groundwork started. It does have a far less capital requirement on the individuals who are entering into that program, and it allows you to get the framework started of how you're going to enter. Now, you do need to have a business and you do need to run it, so it's a much more hands-on option for somebody who's actually going to be operating in the US versus where the EB-5 program might look like something a little bit more long-term, and it's less of a hands-on product, but it's a more of a long-term solution if you know you're going to be living there for a long term. And, for myself, to give you an example, E2 has opened the door for me to be in the US, started to build a business. But as my family starts to think about moving long term and actually living in the US, EB-5 is a program that's starting to creep up, and that it needs to be thought about and discussed regularly because it takes time to put it together. It does have a much larger capital requirement needed, although there's a different way of how that plays out, and it really needs to be implemented in a strategy. If you're not just looking to go and work in the US and have a business here and there and pop back in and out, if your long-term plan is to be in the US, especially for me right now, looking at the EB-5 is something that's required as a long-term solution.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because people, I think okay, there we are. Hi. All right. I was speaking, I couldn't see myself. So that's a great point that you brought up, because E2 does not itself convert automatically to a green card. So you can have an E2 for as long as 5 years at a time and keep on renewing it indefinitely. The issue with the E2 is that it doesn't lead to green permanent residency status. And also what you mentioned is the fact that you actually have to run a business. The business has to continue to remain operational. It's not a passive investment. You have to continue to hire workers, pay workers, payroll, work in the business itself. And a lot of people like the EB-5 green card option because it is kind of like a passive investment, in the sense that you're investing in an existing project that's already creating jobs. The EB-5, the E2 has that, active investment requirement, as opposed to the EB-5, which you can literally just invest and get permanent residency status, sometimes in an expedited manner, and then eventually get your money back once you've invested. But as you said, the EB-5 does have such a higher investment requirement compared to the E2. The EB-5 is requiring $800,000 US. So that is pretty high if you're, but if you're looking towards US permanent residency, long-term planning, the E2 is kind of like a stepping stone, as you mentioned, that could eventually become the foundation for an EB-5 investment.
I think it's also important for people to understand, like, if you have teenage kids and you're on an E2 visa and you're going to need to renew it at one point in that 5-year span, your teenage kids who are covered under your E2 visa might not be covered under your second E2 visa anymore. That being said, too, once they, and I'll let you guys speak to it a little bit further, but if you started an EB-5 program while they're under your house and while they're still kids or teenagers, and get them that EB-5 green card, it's a lot easier for them versus when they're 23 years old after university to get it, because then they're doing it on their own, essentially.
Exactly. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up, because the thing with U.S. immigration law is that it covers you as a principal applicant and your family, but up to a certain point. So it covers the spouse and your children under the age of 21. So you'll get the E2 for as long as your children are under the age of 21. And also with EB-5, you get, it covers the entire family only until your children turn 21, and then they're not covered. And as you said, they'd have to invest on their own. So that's why if you have a family and you want the full entire family to receive the benefits of the visas, whether it's a green card or an E2, it's very important that you start now. Think about long-term residency, children's education, or estate planning in the United States. So that's a perfect bridge into the broader policy landscape. And so that's why I'm going to turn to Alex, who is very, involved with Washington, D.C. and what's happening on Capitol Hill. Alex, you mentioned something called the RIA, which is the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act of 2022, which has made some very significant changes to the EB-5 program. So for investors who are just starting to learn about EB-5, one of the most confusing areas is the concept of reserve visa categories, particularly rural projects. So Alex, I hope you could help us understand what the reserve categories are, why rural projects currently receive priority processing, and how investors should think about timing and backlog risk.
Sure, thanks. So under the new EB-5 program, there are 4 different project categories. So you can invest in a traditional urban project. That would be $1,050,000 US dollar investment, and there's no set aside for that. You're in the main visa category queue, and that has a really long backlog. So that's a pretty unattractive option to most new investors coming into the program. You can also invest in one of the 3 subcategories that have different incentives. So there's a rural category. So a project that's located in a rural location, which is a population of less than 20,000 and outside of a broader MSA. You can also invest at $800,000 in a distressed urban TEA category. So the project is located in a census tract that has at least 1.5 times the national average unemployment rate. Or you can invest at $800,000 in an infrastructure project where the project is partnered with a governmental entity that is helping to administer the project. So it can't just be any standard P3. It's a very specific infrastructure definition. So all 3 of those categories qualify for the lower $800,000 investment. And then each of those categories has a visa set aside. So rural has a 20% visa set aside. So every year there are 10,000 visas that are allocated to the EB-5 program. 2,000 of those visas are set aside for investors that specifically invest in a rural deal. Then there's a 10% set aside for distressed urban projects, or 1,000 visas annually. And then there's a 2% set aside, or 200 visas set aside for the infrastructure project. Those set asides are really important for key markets where EB-5 has been incredibly popular, and there are more investors from that country than there are available visas. The set asides don't matter as much for Canadian investors because while Canadian investors have traditionally used this program, it hasn't been one of the top 3 or 4 markets. And so you could invest in any category and you would be able to receive your visa as soon as your case was adjudicated. One additional incentive that rural projects and rural investors have is called priority processing. And that's something that the Rural Alliance advocated for because we had seen with past projects that some of our members had worked on. One of the key components that investors look at when reviewing different EB-5 projects is the speed to being able to get the green card. So traditional processing times in USCIS for EB-5 were about 6 months for an investor's initial conditional residency application to be adjudicated. Over the years, those started to get stretched out more and more as the program became more popular, and some investors were ultimately having to wait for 3 to 4 years to get their initial application even just looked at by an adjudicator. And so what the priority processing does is it sets up a separate queue for any investors in rural projects, and those investors receive priority processing over investors in non-rural projects. So essentially it speeds up the process to get your initial application reviewed. It's all the same review. You don't get to cut any lines in that way, but you do receive the priority in when your petition will be reviewed from the time that you file it. So right now we're seeing rural investors are getting their applications reviewed in about 3 to 6 months, whereas traditional or TEA with the distressed urban or infrastructure investors are seeing their petitions reviewed in about 9 to 12 months, which is actually faster than what we'd seen traditionally. The USCIS has started to speed up processing times overall, but we are still seeing faster processing times for rural. So if you have children who are getting close to that 21 years to age out of being able to be considered a dependent on your EB-5 visa, a rural project might be a great opportunity for you because you can get your petitions adjudicated really quickly. Or if you have a pressing issue that you would like to make your immigration move to emigrate to the US as quickly as possible, a rural project might be a great option for you as well because of that faster processing time. I would say, and Andrew will get into all of this, but processing times are a great incentive to have you look at rural projects, but you really need to look at all of the underlying aspects of the project. You need to look at the developer, their track record. You need to look at the capital stack to make sure that your money, your investment is truly being protected, which Andrew will get into all of that. But that's kind of a breakdown of the different categories that you could make an investment into under the RA.
That's excellent perspective. And given that, you mentioned, we mentioned that, you're working on the Hill with things happening on Washington. We know that there's something called a grandfathering provision coming up, and that the EB-5 program as it stands is going to be changing. Will either be reauthorized, which we hope and believe will be, but will change in a lot of different ways in terms of investment amount and other types of advantages under the current program as it is. Can you touch on that briefly, please, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. So the EB-5 Regional Center program is not a permanent program, so it has to be reauthorized every few years. Right now, the program is reauthorized through September 30th of 2027, but in this September 30th of 2026, there's a grandfathering provision that will burn off. So right now, any EB-5 investor who invests in a project is locked into the program's laws as they exist today. Any investor who invests after September 30th, 2026, before the program expires, would not be grandfathered into the program as it exists today. So if there were changes that were made, if investment levels were increased, or if the program went away, you could lose your immigration benefits, or you would be required to make additional investments to maintain eligibility. So we have been working, the Rural Alliance has been working really closely with some other industry stakeholders and advocating in Washington to fix the grandfathering clause, but really ultimately get the program reauthorized this year by September 30th, 2026 for an additional 6 to 7 years, rather than just fixing the grandfather clause. So if we can get the program reauthorized this year, the grandfathering clause becomes a non-issue because the program will be reauthorized, and then that will push this grandfathering clause out until the program needs to be reauthorized again at some point in the future. And so our goal and our focus is on getting the program reauthorized in the next handful of months, while Senator Grassley, who's been one of the key offices that's been very focused on EB-5, is still the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, because he has a lot of sway over what happens with the program. And he's been very involved in wanting to make sure that the program is reauthorized, to keep all of these provisions that they put in place under the RIA, and to make sure that the investors don't lose any of their immigration benefits.
All right, thank you so much. So I know we have leaving. Thanks, that was very informative, and I hope everyone pays attention very closely to the fact that this is happening. And obviously, right now the investment amount for EB-5 is $800,000. So it's very good to, if you're interested, to start the process.
Sorry, one other thing really quickly that would be really important for everybody, regardless of the grandfathering provision, if the program's reauthorized or not, the lower investment level, both investment levels are going to increase this January, because under the RIA, the investment levels are tied to CPI to be adjusted every 5 years. So this January, the prices will adjust. And so the lower $800,000 investment level will probably go up to around $930,000 or $940,000. So if you are interested in EB-5, you should start actively pursuing some sort of an investment now, so you can make sure that you get in at the $800,000 level.
Yeah. Yes,
Simone, I'd like to kind of trail on that, but so a couple of things. The grandfathering clause, I'll give you like a prime example of what occurred in the old law before the new law, the RIA, was passed in 2022. What happened was I had clients that were approved waiting for their visa interview in their home country. I think COVID happened first and then the expiration of the program. But what that led to was there was no program available for them to even get an interview date. So they had to wait for the reauthorization of the program. So with the new program, when it was reauthorized, that's the kind of preface of why the grandfathering was implemented, to protect those investors. from that situation occurring again. So there is a deadline that, Alex mentioned of September of 2026, but this processing for getting your documents in order to file isn't a 1 month process. I mean, in many cases, it's 2 to 3 months. So if you're planning on doing this, I would start the process as soon as possible, just so you can figure out, do I want to do this? Do I have the documentation to have an approvable petition? And then at that point, you still have enough time to do the filing. But if you wait till the last minute, attorneys are going to get very busy with applicants trying to beat this deadline. And that's only going to elongate the process of getting the documentation in order. So sooner the better if this is what you want to do.
Excellent point, Andrew. And I could co-sign on that it's definitely takes a long time to get these source of fund documents. Even from Canada, obviously you have to arrange sometimes your funds and make sure everything is transferred appropriately, because source of funds and showing where your money is coming from is very, very important in the EB-5 process. Anyways, that I wanted to, I'm glad Andrew chimed in, because I was going right next to him in terms of how investors actually evaluate projects. So Andrew, from the broker and advisory perspective, investors are often presented with dozens of EB-5 offerings. Alex mentioned the rural project being, if you invest in a rural project, that you get kind of expedited processing, which is very attractive for investors. Some look on the very surface, but why is due diligence so important in going deeper and working with, an investment advisor, somebody who can help them on this? Because this is a huge decision and a huge investment for a lot of people to make. So can you walk us through what serious investors should look at when evaluating an EB-5 project?
Yeah, and I think what's important is that a lot of the applicants from Canada happen to have been born in Canada, so that allows their country of birth to not face retrogression or these pressures from countries with high number of applicants, for example, China and India. That opens up their ability to invest in a variety of areas. So you can do high unemployment and rural. If you are in the States, you can do what's called concurrent filing. So if you're here in the States, what the majority of my Canadian clients are here in the States, they're filing their 526, which is your EB-5 application, along with their adjustment of status from whatever status they're on currently in a legal status. And then they're also filing for their work and their travel permit. So those two things are varying in timeframes right now, let's say 6 to 9 months. But during that time, while your EB-5 is processing, you'll have that ability to work and travel once these two applications are granted to you. So that's an important feature, because it doesn't really focus you on specifically rural areas. And rural projects do come very often, but not as often as these high unemployment deals, just because the market doesn't support a lot of these rural areas. When we're looking at due diligence, we do find a lot of clients, they're getting targeted on Instagram, or they're getting targeted through their networks, and they're kind of pointing them to these shiny buildings in the major metros that they live in. And automatically you assume this shiny building is going to get built, so my capital is secure. But that's not always the case. You really have to go into the background of the regional center, see what their success stories they have, maybe the failures that they've had along the way. Look at what the developer has done. Are you kind of a guinea pig for his first type of offering in this type of industry or asset class? Where are you on this capital stack? Are you in a very secure position where you have a collateral piece that if something were to go wrong, you can at least exit with some kind of backing there? Or are you in a very unsecured position where if something were to go wrong, only a senior bank or a traditional lender would recoup their capital? So a lot of things that we kind of go through this structure with these investors, and it's overwhelming, because a lot of the processes are investors meet a friend that has a project or goes to an attorney who doesn't review projects. And now they're saying, hey, can you help me? And the attorneys legally, maybe they know a couple of companies out there, but they don't know what's going on day to day. And they don't have the legal ability to introduce you or to offer specific offerings they don't have the licensing for under FINRA and the Financial Regulatory Association. So that's kind of where we come to play. We're connecting these dots and helping the investor understand the different situations among different asset classes, among different regional centers and different areas, to tell them, okay, here are the risk factors from the immigration perspective. Here are the risk factors from the financial perspective. Based on those two areas, we understand their risk profile. And based on their risk profile and what they're trying to accomplish, we then match them up with a few options and walk them through the deal from day one until the end of the investment period. So that's another kind of avenue that we're out there to support that think's important, because when you're investing in a specific offering, they're generally going to give you the information that is maybe upfront, but it's not always clear. And we're here to kind of clarify things and keep those regional centers in check and making sure that our investors are fully understanding how the project is flowing, what legislation changes are occurring, and so on. It's overwhelming. I mean, at the end of the day, and we are sleeping and waking up with EB-5 programs and projects being offered to us, and they're consistently changing. So it's a lot for someone who has a full-time job or has a family with young kids to take care of to also learn an entire new industry. And that's kind of where we come and play. And at that point, I mean, we are essentially your fiduciary supporting you along the way. And I think that's an important feature.
And what do you see, I know you work with a lot of Canadians. What do you see, what their, I guess, the challenges that they have, and or what's their interest in the market? Like what do they tend to gravitate towards in this market?
Yeah.
Decide to do EB-5?
I mean, security is their primary focus. We've had some people leaving primarily due to politics that they're leaving. So they tend to go and gravitate towards states or industries that match their political stance. That's been pretty often. We've had some hurdles of investors who they want to spend the summers in Canada and they want to come down here for the balance of the year, or they have a summer home or a lake home somewhere and they haven't been able to leave if they did this concurrent filing, meaning you're kind of locked in the US for a 9-month period, more or less. So that's been a little bit of a hurdle, and we've had some clients apply from outside. The hurdle applying from outside the US and coming in and out on your current valid visa status is, and you can kind of guide me here, Simone, but I believe the wait time for the consulate, once you have an approved EB-5 petition, could take about a year until you have an interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's very true. And if you're like, depending on whether you go through consular processing or concurrent filing, and I think we didn't touch on that, but the benefit of the rules as they stand is that there's an option to concurrently file and adjust your status while your case is pending. So that means that you could actually apply for, you get something called the initial petition called the EB-5, the I-526E petition approved, and then you can also currently file something called an adjustment of status. And that means you don't have to go through the US Embassy in Canada. Everything gets processed here. And there's a little bit of timing issues involved with that you have to get an experienced attorney to walk you through to make sure that, that you're doing everything according to the rules in terms of timing and when you can apply for that. But that's a really great option, that concurrent filing is available for investors, including from Canada. Another point I wanted to quickly touch on, because I think we all kind of discussed this before, was just the understanding of purchasing real estate does not qualify someone for a green card. And we know that there's some marketing that suggests that you could buy a condo and receive US residency. And that's not how EB-5 actually works. The immigration petition and the investment project are two separate legal processes that must be structured carefully. So you just want to, make sure that you understand and work with a trusted advisor, somebody who's been doing this, a real estate broker, investment advisor like Andrew or myself, to kind of understand how it actually works and don't get, pulled in by some of these marketing that you might see as Canadians in Florida or even in Arizona. But anyways, I see that the time is going. So I'd like to just ask everyone one quick question before we wrap up today. And my question is, what is one consideration Canadian investors should not overlook when evaluating the EB-5 pathway? Josh, can we start with you?
Absolutely. I think that the one thing that people shouldn't overlook is the shiny advertising that could be put in front of you on social media about this program. Myself, I've seen a lot of builders out there just trying to move units and condos in Miami, for example, or Fort Lauderdale, just saying, hey, buy a condo, you're going to get an EB-5 green card. And now that I've been through the process, watching other clients go through the process, spending time with Andrew, understanding really how deep this thing is and what it takes to do this properly, I would say take your time, do your due diligence, and talk to some real people, because not everything is as simple as buy a condo and get an EB-5 green card.
Thank you. That's great. Alex?
I would say, don't overlook or make sure you really, really look at the capital stack of the project overall. Make sure that you understand what the underlying collateral is. If something were to happen with the project, what rights do the EB-5 investors have? If it's structured as a loan, is there a senior loan? What does that intercreditor agreement look like? Could the senior loan wipe out the EB-5 loan? Those are really, really important things to look at. And things can change throughout the lifetime of a project. But when you're doing your initial due diligence, really make sure that you understand the breakdown of the capital stack and what that means for your investment and your repayment at some point down the road.
Okay, great. Excellent. Andrew.
Yeah, so we've been hearing a lot about E2s from general countries, not specifically Canada, but not getting renewed or being denied for renewal. So don't fully depend on an E2. It ends up being a lesser investment amount, but in the long term, like Josh said earlier, if you do have kids, those kids will no longer be under your petition. And if they go over at 21, at that point, you may end up wanting to do 2 EB-5s, which is going to be a lot more expensive than kind of going from the beginning. So plan out what you really want to do in your future. Maybe come here on E2, feel it out, how you're feeling in the city that you're in or the country in general. And if this is something you want to do, I think commit to the program. You never know what's going to change within legislation or who's in office and what happens politically. So kind of getting that green card protects you from the future.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone. And I think I'd just end with obviously summarizing what everyone said, which is planning. Immigration planning is best when it's proactive, not reactive, and performing disciplined due diligence and getting the right advisors to really help you evaluate the structure and the risk and everything that's involved, because we know this is a huge decision for everyone making it. And we want to make sure, especially as an attorney, that you get what you're looking for, you get your green card, you get your investment returned, and all of the things that go with EB-5. So I think this was excellent discussion. I hope it was helpful. And I'm going to turn to the audience for a few questions and see what we have here. So I think we have a question for Andrew. Andrew, when should families really begin planning if they have children nearing 21? And how do they work with somebody like you?
Yes. So we have some cases currently where the families are 18, 19. I mean, they're right on the cusp. There's legislation or unknown processes within USCIS of when those ages will be locked. I think it's a discussion right now that's up in the air, but you'd rather not be in that gray area. So if they're 18, 19, I think you're pretty close to having to pull the trigger quickly. If they're 20, I mean, you're going right away. But I think you're still in a little bit of a gray area. So nearing 21, I think 17 and before, you're completely in the clear. 18, you should start really kind of putting your foot on the gas a little bit. And if you're at 20, I mean, you're making a decision within months.
Okay, that's great. Josh, we have a question for you. In terms of working with, helping families find real estate, and is there a way that you can help them find E2 businesses, or this is something that they just have to kind of figure out themselves? Do you have a way of?
Yeah, there's definitely a way that we can help with that. I mean, there's a lot of resources out there, and a lot of businesses are advertised through the MLS on the back end, where you can see that they're being offered as an E2 brokerage. Like the other day, I saw a hair salon that was being sold as an E2 hair salon. So there's definitely that option out there. And if you wanted to find out more, my team can assist with that at Drivers Fork. But there are businesses that you can buy. You don't always have to start from scratch, for sure.
Right. And in terms of the areas in Florida, is there like a particular area that you feel like a lot of Canadians tend to be attracted to in South Florida or mid Tampa, or like where is a good area for people to start if they're actually looking to find a residence?
Yeah, like a lot of people from Toronto have a lot of connectivity in South Florida. So, anywhere from Delray Beach all the way down to Pinecrest or Coral Gables is where a lot of areas happening. I think the majority of people that we see that are moving down from Toronto to Florida are ending up in Aventura, Hollywood, maybe North Miami a little bit, Fort Lauderdale, and now starting a lot is Boca's really starting to pick up where people are moving into. So yeah.
All right, thanks. And finally, Alex, question for you is, in terms of, I know you spoke about the fact that the investment amount is definitely increasing by January 2027, but what is in terms of having because we're letting investors know that this grandfathering is ending September 30th of this year. What does that really mean? For instance, if somebody decides and they miss the deadline and they invest between October 1st and December 31st, what are the risks of doing that?
I mean, I think the risk would really be if the regional center program were to lapse again. And then you would be in a situation similar to the client that Andrew spoke about, where your case is frozen or potentially denied because there's no program. So there's no available visa for you to continue moving forward. But if you invest, on October 2nd and the program is reauthorized by September 30th, 2027, you will have no issues. It's really just in the worst case scenario that the program lapses again, which I really don't foresee happening.
Okay, well, that's good news. That's great news. All right, well, we're reaching up to our time. So I just want to thank everyone today. This was amazing, excellent discussion. I hope it was very informative for everyone who joined us today. If you found this discussion helpful, we'll be continuing the series with additional sessions exploring global EB-5 trends and investor strategies. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you.